All right, welcome back, everyone. We are at it again today with another philosophy lecture. This time on someone who is traditionally not considered a philosopher, one of my personal favorite writers, and that is Oscar Wilde. What we're going to be doing in this lecture is a little bit different. I'm going to be making an argument, somewhat controversial, that Oscar Wilde's aesthetic philosophy, that is the way he understood art, the way he understood beauty, actually has a profound continuity with the Christian, the Neoplatonic, and the Platonic tradition of understanding art, which is to say, it is through the manner of the transcendentals, which I find, again, fascinating. And this is on the heels of, I'm releasing this video just after I actually, believe, 2 weeks ago, released a video on the aesthetic philosophy of St. Basil the Great, as expressed in his famous letter on the right use of Greek literature. And what we're going to see as we explore Oscar Wilde's philosophy is that Oscar Wilde's philosophy of art is in fact profoundly Christian in its orientation, and is in fact profoundly Platonic. That the way St. Basil the Great understood art and the way that Oscar Wilde understood art are actually the same thing, which seems counterintuitive, but it's actually not so strange when we come to consider Oscar Wilde's life. And that's something I want to talk about briefly, the introduction of this particular lecture. So there's a famous literary critic, least famous in Catholic circles, someone I think actually who should be more famous than he currently is, and that's a man by the name of Joseph Pearce. Lived a very interesting life. From what I understand, his father was a famous British neo-Nazi involved in the far-right movements in England. He himself was involved in these far-right movements as a young man, is imprisoned, I believe, for something related to subversive political pamphlets, spreading literature that he shouldn't have been spreading. And in prison, he has a conversion experience, becomes a Roman Catholic, and then later becomes actually what I would say is one of the greatest English language Roman Catholic literary critics of our own time period. He publishes a good number of books and essays on the works of Shakespeare, which I would say are first-rate, are phenomenal pieces of scholarship and literary interpretation, in a field that is so saturated with interpretations. It's very hard to say something new or original or interesting about Shakespeare, but I think Joseph Pearce, actually everything he's written about Shakespeare has changed my mind and changed my own personal interpretations of Shakespeare's works, which I would say is a pretty impressive feat to be able to do something like that in a field where it seems like there's nothing new under the sun, right? He also published a number of famous literary biographies of English language Catholic intellectual figures. So this would be your G.K. Chestertons, and actually, well, interestingly enough, he publishes a biography of Oscar Wilde, who is traditionally not associated with the Catholic world. You would think, oh, well, this sort of more traditional right-wing Catholic figure, what is he doing publishing a biography of Oscar Wilde? Isn't Oscar Wilde sort of the antithesis of everything Roman Catholicism represents? And actually the argument of Joseph Pearce's book, The Unmasking of Oscar Wilde, is to say, no. Oscar Wilde, from the time he was baptized to the moment he died, was always a Catholic, which I find a very interesting argument. It reminds me a lot of something Soren Kierkegaard says, I believe in Either Or, where he says, look, if you have two men, you have one man who is faithful to his wife except at the moment of death, right? For, let's say, 70 years. He's kind to her. He gives her everything she wants. He's incredibly loving, empathic, understanding, brings her roses, does all the nice husband things. Helps take care of the kids, just is a respectful, good gentleman. And then, let's say, a couple days before she dies, cheats on her, does some awful things behind her back, and then she dies, and then he dies. Kierkegaard would say that man never loved his wife. Not that, he loved his wife 99.99999% of the time, and then, he made a mistake right at the end, and no big deal. Mathematically speaking, he loved his wife more than he didn't love her, right? There were more days where he was doing the right thing than the wrong thing. Kierkegaard would say, no. It's not a numbers game. He never loved his wife. And vice versa, Kierkegaard would say, if you imagine the worst husband humanly possible, abusive, selfish, just piggish, just like an awful, truly nasty person. And he's this way for 70 years. And then in the last moments, as she's on her deathbed, he says to his wife, I regret how I treated you. I feel as if I'm the worst human being on this entire planet. I never deserved your goodness. I would do anything to be able to go back in time to reverse my actions. I can't even begin to fathom the amount of hurt that I have caused you, so on and so forth. He does all these things and sincerely means it. Kierkegaard would say that man always loved his wife. Not that like he hated his wife 99.9999% of the time, and then 0.01% mathematically he loved his wife right at the end. It's not a numbers game. It's about what happens in the key critical moment. And what do we know about Oscar Wilde is that Oscar Wilde, not quite a deathbed, literally on his deathbed, but right at the very end of his life, he converts and becomes a faithful Roman Catholic. Even though it seems he was baptized when he was younger, there's a whole controversy over that. You can read about that in the book. But at the end of his life, he becomes a professing Roman Catholic, which is interesting because many of the figures that Oscar Wilde admired also did something similar. Baudelaire goes through a similar transition. Huysmans also goes through a similar transition. And this is interesting, right? Because we often put Oscar Wilde in with the aesthetes, right? That, Oscar Wilde, his aesthetic philosophy is art for art's sake. He's anti-capitalist. He's anti-industrial revolution. And he just wants to sort of put out a place for art away from practical utility. Those things are definitely true. But that idea of a space for art independent of practical utility, and this is the point that I'm going to try to make in this lecture, is actually a profoundly Christian idea. And actually even early, it's not even necessarily a Christian idea. It's a profoundly Platonic idea. It's an idea that Christianity adopts from Platonism. It's an idea that's in complete conformity with the Old and New Testaments. But it's an idea that we see in Plato, and it's an idea that comes from the Transcendentals. And so Oscar Wilde is not really doing something radically new or sort of invented in the late 19th century that's like, this sort of radical, subversive, anti-capitalist. Yes, it is subversive. Yes, it is radical. Yes, it's anti-capitalist. But the origins of Oscar Wilde's aesthetic philosophy are in Catholicism. And the origins of the Catholic aesthetic philosophy are in the Church Fathers. And the origin of the Church Fathers' aesthetic philosophy is in the Neoplatonists. And the origin of the Neoplatonist aesthetic philosophy is in Plato, is in the doctrine of the Transcendentals. And so the point that Joseph Pearce tries to make is that Oscar Wilde was always a Catholic. Oscar Wilde always conceived of the world, you could say his cosmovision. I don't like the term ideology, but the lens through which he understood the world, even as he was a sinner, someone who did not obey the Catholic morality for the vast majority of his life, and in fact flouted it openly, he always understood things in Catholic terms. And what we're going to see is the preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray, which, by the way, The Picture of Dorian Gray, I would say, is a profoundly Christian novel, a profoundly Christian novel in every sense of the word. The preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray says the exact same things that St. Basil the Great is saying in his letter on the right use of Greek literature, that there's no difference between those two things. So Joseph Pearce makes this argument in his biography. I definitely recommend reading it, but it's kind of the origin for my particular analysis and my particular breakdown of the preface, which I'm going to try to distance it from the philosophy of aestheticism, art for art's sake. Obviously, Oscar Wilde was a student of Walter Pater. There is an influence. Obviously, Oscar Wilde was very influenced by Baudelaire, Huysmans, Rimbaud, so on and so forth. We're going to see, I think, the origins of these particular ideas come from somewhere else and come from something much earlier. Now, there is an interesting recuperation of Oscar Wilde in the Catholic world. You have this particular press that puts out critical editions of Oscar Wilde's work, Ignatius Critical Editions. Actually, it's a press that's run by Joseph Pearce. They put out a critical edition maybe 10, 15 years ago of Oscar Wilde's A Picture of Dorian Gray that is recommendable and that I think actually offers a quite interesting interpretation of the novel that's very different from the mainstream interpretations. But this is not something that's just the prerogative of Joseph Pearce either. Another author I very much admire, you may know about him from my other videos. I have some translations of his on my channel. Father Leonardo Castellani, who is an Argentine Jesuit. He writes a really interesting book. I don't really know how to describe it. It's partially theology, it's partially philosophy, it's partially itself a literary work, a work of art. It's an all-around interesting work, and it's a work that I'm actually trying to translate to English right now, called Christ and the Pharisees. And there's a chapter right at the end of Christ and the Pharisees on Oscar Wilde. And Father Leonardo Castellani, actually 40 years before Joseph Pearce, makes a really interesting argument, where he says, was Oscar Wilde's personal life sinful? He says yes. Was Oscar Wilde's personal life in conformity with Roman Catholic teaching? He says no. However, and this is the point he makes, he says Oscar Wilde, at his core, is probably one of the most Christian writers in England at the end of the 19th century. And actually, Father Leonardo Castellani goes further, and he says every single person who condemned Oscar Wilde in Oscar Wilde's own society, which is Victorian England, was worse than Oscar Wilde. So every person who, during the famous trial about him and Lord Alfred Douglas, you can go look into all of this, every single person who condemned Oscar Wilde and said, oh, how could he have done such a thing? Oh, he's so immoral. Oh, he's such a bad influence. Father Leonardo Castellani says the argument, no. Those were Pharisees. Victorian England was 1,000 times more morally corrupt and anti-Christian than anything that Oscar Wilde could have possibly imagined or done. And he says, for the Victorians to condemn Oscar Wilde and ignore their own sins, to ignore the way the British imperial structure, to ignore the way the Anglican Church, to ignore the way that the British cosmovision of liberalism was in many ways rooted in anti-Christian thought, and to just say we should condemn Oscar Wilde because of this act that had been discovered, and say that Oscar Wilde is worse than us and make ourselves superior, Father Leno Castellani says that's Pharisaism. That's Pharisaism in its most apt point. And that Oscar Wilde should be understood primarily as a Christian writer, which I agree. And what we're going to see in this particular lecture is that his aesthetic philosophy is in total consonance with everything that is taught by the church, and in total consonance with the entire tradition of aesthetic philosophy going all the way back to Plato. Now, this is the preface from his first and only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. It's a phenomenal novel. I highly recommend you read it. We're not going to get too much into the biography of Oscar Wilde in this video, nor are we going to get into an interpretation of The Picture of Dorian Gray or talk about how the preface relates to The Picture of Dorian Gray. Those would be interesting endeavors. But what I really want to do is just analyze the preface, again, in relation to this larger idea of the Platonic aesthetic philosophy. And so what we're going to do is we're going to give it a read, and then we're going to break it down line by line, because it is notoriously difficult. It is a little dense. It is a little difficult to figure out what Oscar Wilde is saying. And once we break it down, we will relate it back to these larger macro trends in aesthetic philosophy. Good. Okay, with no further ado, let's go ahead and give this a read. So this is the preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray. The artist is the creator of beautiful things. To reveal art and conceal the artist is art's aim. The critic is he who can translate into another manner or a new material his impression of beautiful things. The highest, as the lowest form of criticism, is a mode of autobiography. Those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things are corrupt without being charming. This is a fault. Those who find beautiful meanings in beautiful things are the cultivated. For these there is hope. They are the elect to whom beautiful things mean only beauty. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. It's delightful. I have to make a comment. It's so delightful. Anyway, the 19th century dislike of realism is the rage of Caliban seeing his own face in a glass. The 19th century dislike of romanticism is the rage of Caliban not seeing his own face in a glass. The moral life of man forms part of the subject matter of the artist, but the morality of art consists in the perfect use of an imperfect medium. No artist desires to prove anything. Even things that are true can be proved. No artist has ethical sympathies. An ethical sympathy in an artist is an unpardonable mannerism of style. No artist is ever morbid. The artist can express everything. Thought and language are to the artist instruments of an art. Vice and virtue are to the artist materials for an art. From the point of view of form, the type of all arts is the art of the musician. From the point of view of feeling, the actor's craft is the type. All art is at once surface and symbol. Those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril. Those who read the symbol do so at their peril. It is the spectator and not life that art really mirrors. Diversity of opinion about a work of art shows that the work is new, complex, and vital. When critics disagree, the artist is in accord with himself. We can forgive a man for making a useful thing as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that one admires it intensely. All art is quite useless. It's phenomenal. All art is quite useless. Very moving set of lines. Now, initially somewhat confusing, but what we're going to do is, and hopefully without extending myself too much, I could probably take 2 or 3 hours with this, we're going to break down each line and figure out, okay, what is Oscar Wilde trying to say about art here in this preface? And it's something of a manifesto, I would say, of the traditional doctrine of the transcendentals in the Platonic view and the Neoplatonic view of art. We begin with the artist is the creator of beautiful things. So this and foremost is like, what is an artist? An artist is someone who creates beautiful things. Beginning and end. And this is going to become very important in subsequent points, because what Oscar Wilde is going to say effectively is that an artist is not a propagandist. An artist is not a propagandist, and an artist cannot be used for practical ends. So there is no such thing as an artist who is trying to do something other than create a beautiful thing. There is no such thing as an artist who is trying to do something other than create a beautiful thing. The artist has one goal, and that is to create objects of beauty. Now, this is really interesting in the sense that a lot of the modern discourse about art is talked about in relation to practical ends. So, from my personal context, one of the places where I've seen this most is in the world of American Christianity, whereby many American Christians, mostly Protestants, though many Catholics as well, and I think I talked about this in the video on St. Basil the Great, they essentially are going to make the claim that only Christians can make good art, or that we should only look at art that is produced by other Christians. And to that end, we take a movie like God Is Not Dead, which is an awful movie. We take a movie like Unplanned, which is an awful movie. And effectively, these people say, but they convey good moral messages. They're propaganda, but they're propaganda that I agree with. And so because they're propaganda that I agree with, we are going to say that those are films worth watching. Whereas other films, which contain things that are immoral, or depictions of immorality, regardless of how beautiful they may be, whatever, we could say, like, Fight Club. Fight Club would be a great example. You know Bishop Robert Barron? One of the foremost Catholic intellectuals of our own time period. He obviously has a large social media presence with Word on Fire, so on and so forth. Bishop Robert Barron loves Fight Club. He has a movie, not a movie. He has an analysis of Fight Club, and he talks about Fight Club. He has seen the movie Fight Club. There is a Catholic bishop of his stature who has watched Fight Club. This is not strange. This should not be considered strange that a Catholic can watch a secular movie that is appreciated by many people and find things to appreciate about it and to appreciate it on an aesthetic level. But some people get really scandalized by this, and they say, no. Just only watch things that convey my moral point of view. Or, for example, they could never watch a Soviet film. There are so many beautiful Soviet films. But no. Those convey communism. They were produced in a communist worldview. I can't watch them, regardless of how beautiful they may be. I can only watch things that confirm a particular worldview. And so what the artist then becomes is a propagandist. What the artist then becomes is no. The artist is no longer the creator of beautiful things. The artist is instead the person who serves a particular practical end by trying to convince people of things. The artist's goal then is to try to convince you that Christianity is true. Or look at the Soviet Union with Soviet realism. The artist's goal is to convince you of a particular worldview and of your particular place in it. And all of a sudden, art becomes subordinate to practical ends. And Wilde is very clear. He says, no. The goal of the artist is to create beautiful things. And we're going to come back to that point. The goal of the artist is one thing and one thing only, which is to create things of beauty. You could think of it another way, another metaphor that I often give for this, is that the artist captures beauty the way light moves through a stained glass window. Is that the light is moving through him. The beauty is moving through him. Will it convey aspects of him as a necessity? Yes, no doubt. A Christian artist who produces a thing of beauty, that thing of beauty is going to have a Christian flavor. But a true Christian artist, like for example, Tarkovsky. Tarkovsky, I would say, is one of the greatest Christian filmmakers of all time. Tarkovsky's films have a Russian Orthodox flavor to them because Tarkovsky himself was a religious man. And the beauty moved through him and took on that particular flavor. Just as when the beauty moves through Pasolini, another great filmmaker. Pasolini's films take on his cast, right? They take on aspects of his worldview as an Italian Marxist. And those things are going to come out, that sort of flavor, or sort of the, what do you want to say? The mix of different elements of his personality, his character, his ideology, they're going to come out. But the goal of Pasolini, just as the goal of Tarkovsky, was not to create a film that is propaganda. Their goal was to create beautiful films, and as a result of creating beautiful films and allowing the beauty to pass through them, it took on the color of the light of their stained glass, if that makes sense. That's the metaphor I usually use to try to explain this. But when someone tries to create a work of art for a propagandistic end to say, no, 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 I am going to create this particular work of art in order to do this. I'm going to write the great Christian novel. I am going to write the great Marxist novel. I am going to, whatever, pick your ideology, pick your religion. It always fails because the goal of the artist is one thing and one thing only, which is to create beautiful things. The moment the artist tries to do something other than to create something beautiful, they are no longer producing art and they are no longer acting as an artist. Very important point to clarify because we're going to come back to this later with some of the subsequent points. To reveal art and to conceal the artist is art's aim. Yeah, and so notice, he doesn't say that art conceals the artist. He says the art's aim itself is to conceal the artist and to reveal art. Now, Oscar Wilde is going to acknowledge that art always does take on aspects of its creator. So, for example, he has a very famous quote, which has served me well in many, many years of literary analysis, where he says, "A novelist's first novel is always a portrayal of the author as either Christ or Faust." An author's first novel is always a portrayal of that author as either Christ or Faust. And if you look at first novels of any author that you like, you will see that that is 100% true. And of course, The Picture of Dorian Gray, the first and last novel of Oscar Wilde, is a portrayal of Oscar Wilde himself as Faust. I think that's very obvious. And so Oscar Wilde understood and knew that aspects of an artist's personality carry into the art. But he says, art itself is trying to hide the artist and to reveal the art, which is to say, to reveal the beauty. And if you think back to previous eras of history, when I would say the production of art was more natural and more intuitive, artists did not sign their own work. Some of the most beautiful pieces of music that we have, some of the most beautiful paintings, some of the most beautiful cathedrals, literary works, are totally anonymous. Think, for example, of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. We say this is a production of the Pearl Poet. Why? Because we have no idea who the Pearl Poet is, and we'll probably never know. Same with many cathedrals, many paintings. We don't know who designed them. We just don't know, because for the medievals, the goal in an era that I would say is much more influenced by the Christian aesthetic philosophy, very obviously, by Neoplatonism, the goal was to reveal art. The goal was to show beauty. It was not to say art is an expression of my own genius. This is something that comes out of Romanticism that I think Oscar Wilde, in spite of the fact that Oscar Wilde loved to go around telling people he was a genius, in spite of the fact that, yes, Oscar Wilde had a big ego, Oscar Wilde also understood art is not just to reveal the personality of the artist. Does it reveal the personality of the artist? Yes, but as a secondary cause. Any art whose primary goal is, I want to show the world how great I am, is inferior art. Because why? Go back to the first point. The artist is the creator of beautiful things. It doesn't say the artist is the creator of works that express his personality. The artist is the creator of works that express his individuality. This is a very modern concept, is that a band, a painter, a filmmaker, they make those things to express their individuality and their genius. That's why I was saying, no. Their goal is to create beauty. Their goal is to create beauty. And in order to create beauty, they have to try to hide themselves. Will they hide themselves? No, but they must try to hide themselves. Then he moves, interestingly, to the critic, meaning the person who talks about art, the person who breaks down art, the person who discusses art. And this one I take personally because, of course, I consider myself a critic. I am not an artist. I would say maybe the way I teach has aspects of an art to it. I view teaching as an art form. I love teaching. I try to convey a sense of beauty in the way I arrange my lectures, in the way that I arrange my teaching, but it's clearly inferior to producing a novel. I would say, no doubt, my place in life is inferior to that of a novelist. It's inferior to that of a filmmaker. I'm a literary critic. I'm someone who breaks down the works of art of others. Is that an important task? Yes, but it's a secondary task. Because I'm not creating beauty. I am breaking down things of beauty. And this is what Oscar Wilde says of the critic. The critic is he who can translate into another manner or a new material his impression of beautiful things. So what I do as a critic, and I think this is so apt, because this is true. This is what I've taught now, my goodness. I've taught for almost a decade. I've been teaching for almost a decade now. And so what I do as a teacher is I read something and I am moved by it because I have an aesthetic sensibility, because I have the background and you could say the disposition of soul to be moved by a work of art. My students, who are young and some of whom will never have an artistic disposition, do not have that. Some of them will eventually acquire that disposition, but it requires training, it requires a lot of reading, it requires a lot of immersion in music and film and all of the different arts. And they're just immature. Even a 16-year-old who one day is going to become a great artist is not necessarily going to be moved by the picture of Dorian Gray the way I am moved by the picture of Dorian Gray at 30 years old and after having studied literature very seriously for about 15 years, right? And so what I have to do is I am conveying my impression, saying, no. You read the picture of Dorian Gray and you're young. You understand maybe 5% of it. I, with my experiences, with my sensibility, I am going to convey to you what it is like for me to read the picture of Dorian Gray. And I translate the beauty that I experience into another medium, which is an essay of literary criticism, which is as a lecture on a particular topic. And I am taking the beauty that I experience and I am translating it into another form. That is my job as a critic. I am taking the impressions that a work of art gives to me and I am explaining them to an audience who doesn't have those impressions so that they can culture themselves and see what someone cultivated experiences when they look at a work of art, but also so that they too can have impressions of a work of art, so that they too can acquire the ability to see something beautiful and allow themselves to be moved by it, because it's not always a natural thing. And I say that's very apt. That is definitely what a critic does. And he continues. He says, the highest as the lowest form of criticism is a mode of autobiography. This is phenomenal. Because it's true. I've known many talented literary critics. I've read a lot of literary criticism, and I think there is nothing more apt. Is that when a critic is analyzing a work of art, they are making an autobiography. What a critic says about a work of art, positive or negative, so if they're making an evaluation, or how a critic analyzes a work of art, or how a critic conveys the beauty he experiences in a work of art to an audience, says almost more about him than it does about the work of art. It is a form of autobiography, where effectively you are conveying aspects of your personality and who you are by what you say of a work of art. I think, for example, very famous literary critic Harold Bloom. Sure, you've heard of Harold Bloom. If you don't, go look him up. He's probably the most famous American literary critic of the 20th century, one of the most famous. Harold Bloom's evaluation of Shakespeare, which is in the stratosphere, where I think he puts Shakespeare on a level that is just absolutely ridiculous. And in particular, his valorization of the character of Falstaff, which he says is Falstaff is Shakespeare's most psychologically well-developed character, is Shakespeare's most interesting character, is just gushing about how much he loves Falstaff and why Falstaff is such a superior character and Shakespeare such a superior mind, so on and so forth. Well, there's something autobiographical, because if you look at Harold Bloom's own life, his values, his cosmovision, his orientation in the world, Harold Bloom sees himself as Falstaff. And so his criticism of Shakespeare has everything to do with his understanding of Falstaff and with his understanding of himself as being like Falstaff. And so Harold Bloom's literary criticism becomes just as much about Harold Bloom as it does about the text in question. You see this also with his idea that the struggles that artists have are always trying to, wrestle with their forefathers. So that an artist, when they're producing a work of art, there's a form of agonism, whereby they are wrestling with the artist who came before them and trying to sort of fight them and dominate them. Well, there's something of that too in Harold Bloom himself, right? If you look at Harold Bloom's own artistic career, which was not that great, he was not that talented of an artist, you can see that in Harold Bloom's literary criticism, there is something of agonism. There is something of an attempt to fight the father and dominate the father in the criticism itself. And so that's to say it's autobiographical. Another clear example of this would be oh my goodness, in William Blake's analysis of Milton's work. Because William Blake says of Milton that he was of the devil's party and didn't know it. Meaning, if you look at how Satan is described in Paradise Lost, John Milton unconsciously favors Satan and is not aware of it. Now, that's a fascinatingly novel interpretation of Paradise Lost. But what's really interesting about this is effectively that interpretation of Paradise Lost, Blake is saying Milton has it. But really, that tells us more about Blake than it does about Milton, because if there's anyone who's of the devil's party, it's certainly Blake and not Milton. Milton was a very devout Puritan, essentially. Blake very clearly has heterodox, heretical views, and when he reads into Milton as unconsciously favoring Satan, I think that says a lot more about Blake than it actually does about the work of art itself. Which is to say, anytime someone is saying something about a work of art, it's like a Rorschach test. You know, if you've seen a Rorschach test, it's just like the blots of ink on a page. It's a neutral stimuli. Those blots do not represent anything. It's just ink spilled on a page. But when you say, oh, it looks like clouds. Oh, it looks like a knife. oh, it looks, you're saying things about yourself when you analyze the Rorschach test. And similarly, when you say things about a work of art, you are also speaking about yourself. And I think that's apt. Criticism becomes a form of autobiography. Very astute comment on the part of Oscar Wilde. Let's continue forward. Those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things are corrupt without being charming. This is a fault. So this is I agree with this. People who see something beautiful, a work of art, from wherever it comes from, and give it a bad interpretation and say there's something ugly about it, they are corrupt. In other words, there is something wrong with their personality. You can say there's something wrong with their soul. To look at something beautiful and to find something corrupt in it is to have something seriously wrong with your soul. Now, this goes back to the transcendentals. Well, why? Because truth, goodness, and beauty are the same thing. That which is beautiful must also be true. There is no such thing as a beautiful thing which is not also true. And vice versa. That which is virtuous, which is moral, which is good, must also be beautiful. But conversely, what is beautiful is also moral. There is no such thing as something that is beautiful that is not also moral. And that's why if we continue down here, he says, there is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Well, a lot of Christian readers in the 19th century, and Christian readers still to this day, get super obsessed about it. Like, they hate this comment. Imagine you saying to someone who really believes that you have to be careful what films you watch, you have censorship, this, that, the other. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral film. Well, that's actually true. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral film in themselves. Books are well written or badly written. Films are well produced or poorly produced. That is all. Why? What matters? Go back to the first comment. The artist is the creator of beautiful things. The goal is to create something beautiful. If a film is beautiful, it is also a moral film. If a book is beautiful, it is also a moral book. If a piece of music is beautiful, it is also a moral piece of music. And vice versa. If a book is ugly, it is an immoral book. If a film is ugly, it is an immoral book. And so I would always say this to sort of nettle certain students that I would work with, just to sort of, not to pick on them in any way, but to encourage them to think about things. A film like Unplanned, which was very popular in the Catholic world when it came out, I think in 2019, 2018, I had people get, very upset with me. Like, tears in their eyes, red in the face, upset with me. Because I said, I don't think Unplanned is just a bad film. Like, it's not like, oh, I didn't like it, but, I'm happy it's conveying a good message for the culture, blah, blah, blah. I said, I think Unplanned is an immoral film. I think Unplanned is a positive, moral bad film. You should not watch it. It is harmful or deleterious to morality. Why? Because it's ugly. The acting is bad. The story is bad. There's no symbolism. There's no subtlety. It's just a direct, in-your-face work of propaganda. It may be propaganda, I agree with, but it's propaganda. And just because it's propaganda I agree with doesn't somehow make it beautiful. And in fact, I think it's bad. I would not want someone to watch that film. Because why? The criteria is it beautiful or not? Conversely, and I mentioned this in the video on St. Basil the Great, the Vatican has an official list of films that they recommend. Semi-official. It's through the Vatican's journal. But for the 100th anniversary of film, they put out a list of 45 films, each in 3 categories. So 15 films in the category of morality, 15 films in the category of Christianity or religion, 15 films in the category of just art. And one of the films that shows up in the category of religion, meaning a film that the Vatican believes promotes the cause of religion, that promotes the Christian religion and is a great film, is Pasolini's The Gospel According to St. Matthew, which is a film I find extraordinarily beautiful. I try to watch it once every Easter. Have I always done that? No, but I've seen it a good number of times now, and I'm always moved to tears every time I watch it. It's a film like no other. The Passion of the Christ is 1 million times it's inferior. I cannot stand The Passion of the Christ. But The Gospel According to St. Matthew is one of the most moving films I've ever seen in my entire life. It's on another level. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. I think it's available freely online at this point. I think it's probably public domain. You can take a look at archive.org. If I'm wrong, go buy it. But in any case, The Passion of the Christ, not the Passion of the Christ, the Gospel according to St. Matthew was produced by Pasolini. Well, Pasolini, as everyone knows, was an openly gay, openly atheist, openly Marxist Italian filmmaker and writer. And yet the Vatican found it fit to put his film on the list of films that they recommend for Christians to watch. Why? Because it's a beautiful film. Because it's a beautiful film. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written, that is all. Pasolini's film is a beautiful film. It is a well-produced film. And so to that extent, it also must be true, reflective of the way the world is, and it also must be morally good. That is the only criteria by which we are to assess a work of art. Is it beautiful or is it not? If a work of art is beautiful, it is good. It is morally good. There are no questions about this. That is the unity of the transcendentals. So Oscar Wilde, again, going back to the Platonic theory of art. Those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things are corrupt without being charming. To see a beautiful thing and to blaspheme against it, to say that is not a beautiful thing, that is an ugly thing, is to be corrupt without being charming, is to show a serious defect of soul and to not even have the redeeming quality of being charming. It's just to display one's dysfunction for all to see. And I would 100% agree with that. Now, some people say, well, what about taste? What if I don't like science fiction movies and then you show me Blade Runner? Well, taste and beauty are two different things. And I would always bring this up with students because by the Platonic theory or the Neoplatonic theory or the Christian theory or whatever we want to call this theory of art and the transcendentals, beauty is objective. Beauty is as objective as truth. And I'm always surprised by this because many people in, sort of the general American Christian circle, you ask them, is truth objective? They will say yes. You ask them, is morality objective? They'll say yes. They'll say there's a clear right and wrong. There are clear lines. There is clear truthhood and falsehood. You ask them, is beauty objective? Most of them will say no, which is interesting. They have this sort of subjectivist postmodern understanding of beauty. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. But they do not have an objective understanding of beauty. Beauty is objective. Taste is subjective. So, for example, the example I often give is that we are all able to appreciate someone of the opposite sex who is beautiful. So a woman can look at a man and say, he's beautiful. That is a beautiful man. He's very handsome. He's very good looking. But that man may not be to her taste. She may be able to say, objectively, that man is extraordinarily beautiful. But personally, I like men who are taller. I like men who have beards. I like men who have this, that, the other. They can name traits and say, that man doesn't have a beard. He's kind of short. But I can still say, objectively speaking, he is a very handsome, attractive man, even though he is not to my taste. Similarly with film, I may not be into science fiction. But I can watch Blade Runner and go, that is a beautiful film. Even if it is not to my personal taste, I can acknowledge that there is something objectively beautiful about that. Most people get this. That's confusing for some reason, leave a comment. But most people get the difference between beauty and taste. Beauty is objective. Beauty is as objective as truth. It is as objective as morality. Now next, I like this comment as well. Those who find beautiful meanings in beautiful things are the cultivated. For these there is hope. They are the elect to whom beautiful things mean only beauty. And beauty capitalized. Beauty capitalized to signify the transcendental. Who are the elect? He uses that religious language for a reason. Who are the elect? Those who can see a beautiful thing and see that it reflects beauty. They don't need to use it for some sort of practical end. They're not trying to propagandize people. They're not trying to use the art to accomplish some particular effect. They're not trying to solve world hunger with art. They're not trying to solve the human condition with art. They're not using art to, build a bridge. They're not using art to propagate an ideology. They look at a work of art and they say, that is beautiful. And for them, that is sufficient. That, for Oscar Wilde, is to be one of the elect for whom beautiful things mean beauty. Good so far. Any questions on any of this, always feel free to leave a comment or just leave a comment in general. I love reading comments. But we are going to continue forward with the preface. Otherwise, my goodness, 40 minutes. I'm going to be here all night. Good. Next, let's take a look here. The 19th century dislike of realism is the rage of Caliban seeing his own face in a glass. Well, who is Caliban? We should know Caliban is the monster in Shakespeare's play The Tempest. And if we know anything about Caliban, he's, of course, enslaved to Prospero. Prospero is an intelligent wizard. Caliban is this sort of dumb, brutish, ignorant monster. And so he's comparing his 19th century contemporaries, the people with whom he lives, right? The people that Father Leonardo Castellani are going to say effectively are Pharisees, that their sins were 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times more vile than anything Oscar Wilde did. His contemporaries are like Caliban. They're like this brutish, ignorant, nasty monster. Why do they dislike realism? It's the rage of Caliban seeing his own face in a glass. So when people in the 19th century look at a novel of, let's say, Émile Zola, and they go, oh, disgusting. Émile Zola and his lurid social realism, talking about working class people and talking about their problems and talking about like all sorts of nasty things that we shouldn't talk about in public. That's disgusting. He says, why do they dislike realism? Because it's a mirror. It says, no. If this novel upsets you in some way, it's because you are reflected in it. If you don't like the realism of the late 19th century, that is precisely because you do not like looking at yourself. Because what Émile Zola does, what later Steinbeck will do, what all of the realist and naturalist writers effectively do, is they hold up a mirror and say, this is the world that you have created. This is the world that you have created. And the dislike of realism is Caliban's hatred at having to look at himself. Now, vice versa, and I love this. The 19th century dislike of romanticism is the rage of Caliban not seeing his own face in a glass. So, when the 19th century public reads the romantic novels and they hate them, they hate the fact that they do not see themselves in romanticism. Because romanticism reflects a world more beautiful, more pure, more ideal than the actual world of the 19th century. And they hate that that world does not reflect who they are. So there, in a certain sense, there's no pleasing the 19th century literary critics. When they see what they are, they hate it. When they see what they are not, they are also filled with hatred. Because why? They are those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things. They are corrupt without being charming. They do not have the redeeming quality of being able to perceive a beautiful thing as being beautiful. And so for that reason, they can neither understand realism nor romanticism, the two major literary trends of 19th century literature. Good. The moral life of man forms part of the subject matter of the artist, but the morality of art consists in the perfect use of an imperfect medium. Beautiful lines, beautiful lines. The moral life of man forms part of the subject matter of the artist, meaning morality to an artist is material. So human beings committing sins, human beings doing heroic things, those are to an artist material. The way that I could use planks of wood to make a house, the way that I could use paint to make a painting. The moral life of man is the material for the artist. What does that mean? Is there such thing as a good or bad material? Well, there's good or bad material relatively, good or bad material for a particular purpose. But this is where people get things wrong. I had someone very sincere. Their sincerity was not in doubt. But I had someone once come up to me and say, I do not think 16-year-old should read Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. And I said, why? And he said, the depiction of adultery is so detailed in that particular novel that I think it will convince other people to commit adultery. And this to me is somewhat absurd, right? But the idea is that, look, we should not show off works of art that talk about sin in graphic detail. So adulterous relationships, like Tristan and Isolde would be a clear example. The Wagner opera Tristan and Isolde. That should be banned. It's contrary to public decency and morality. Or we could go through other examples. Adultery, drug use, murder, violence, theft, lying. We should not have works of art which depict these nasty sides of human beings. Our violence, our passions, our sexuality. And interestingly enough, one of the comments that I have heard on this that I've always found most agreeable and that I bring up in these contexts, it also comes from Bishop Robert Barron. You can tell I have a lot of respect for that man in particular. One of the things that Bishop Robert Barron says in this regard, he says, well, I've had people come up to me and say, hey, at the time I think he was Father Robert Barron. Father, why are you making these YouTube videos about all these films in which there's all these nasty things? There's, sex, there's violence, there's this, that, the other. Bishop Robert Barron says, you want to talk about a book that is full of violence? that is full of people lying, full of the whole spectrum and gamut of all of the nastiest, worst human behavior that you could ever possibly imagine, let's just open the Bible. The Bible is full of all of humanity's good and evil features on display. Everything that is good and noble about human beings is present in the Bible. And everything that is evil about human beings is present in the Bible. And the Bible does not shy away from talking about sexuality, talking about violence, talking about the worst, most degraded aspects of human beings, and also the most noble and exalted aspects of human beings. The Bible deals with all of it. And so Bishop Robert Aaron says effectively what I think Oscar Wilde is saying here, which is that no. You do not judge a work of art based on the fact that, it only includes moral topics. Or, it only includes bad topics. You can have a work of art that's all about people doing evil, bad things. And vice versa, you can have a work of art about good people doing nothing but good things. Is it beautiful? That is the test of whether or not it is a good work of art. Is it beautiful? Because if it's beautiful, it is a faithful representation of reality. And if it's beautiful, it's also moral. That is the test. Human moral actions, good or bad, are for the artist just material. The artist is to depict human beings in all of their good and evil facets. Continuing forward, the morality of art consists in the perfect use of an imperfect medium. That goes back to this point. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. Morality of art consists in the perfect use of an imperfect medium. What is meant by this? The perfect use of an imperfect medium means to take something that is imperfect, that cannot convey absolute beauty. Music cannot convey absolute beauty. There are limitations. There are limitations on literature. There are limitations on film. There are limitations on painting. There are limitations on any work of art. But it's to take that imperfect medium and to use it as perfectly as possible to convey beauty. That is what makes art moral or immoral. How well does it use the medium? In other words, to assess the morality of a film is to ask, how good is it at being a film? To assess how moral a novel is to say, how good is this novel at being a novel? That is the question. Is it beautiful or is it not? Did the author write the novel well? Because if they did, it's moral. That's all there is to it. And this actually goes back to Plato's discussion and Aristotle's discussion of what makes a moral human being. Aristotle is going to say, in the Nicomachean Ethics, we determine that a human being is moral or immoral to the extent that they do what a human being does well. So, for example, if I have a pen, which I do, I've got this pen right here. We determine if a pen is a good pen or a bad pen to the extent that it does what a pen does. And so if I have this pen, right, it clicks, I can write with it, the ink is good, it allows me to convey my thoughts, it allows me to correct my students' work, so on and so forth. It's good at being a pen. Because it does what a pen does well. Well, how do we assess whether a human being is good? A good human being should do what a human being does well. Well, what distinguishes human beings from all other beings? Human beings are rational. And so for Aristotle, to be a good human being is to be rational. And to be rational means for his acts to be rational and measured. All of a human being's acts should be reasonable. And for Aristotle, immorality, vice, and sin were just actions that were against the just mean. They're actions that are irrational. So excessive anger is irrational anger. Lack of anger, when something bad happens to you, is also irrational. And so for Aristotle, we can determine all human actions based on, are human beings doing what human beings do well? Is a human being acting rationally? Because why? Human beings are rational animals. What distinguishes us from all other animals, from all other plants, from all other minerals, from all other beings in the universe is that we alone are rational. And so if a man is rational and acting rationally, we can say that he's a good human being. Well, how do you assess whether a film is morally good then? Does it do what a film does well? How do you assess whether a work of music is moral? Do you look at the composer? Do you look at the composer and say, oh, the composer's a moral man, therefore it's a moral work? No. Is it good at being a piece of music? Because if it's good at being a piece of music, it's beautiful. And if it's beautiful, it is moral. This is the claim that Oscar Wilde is making. Good. No artist desires to prove anything. Even things that are true can be proved. I love this. So the artist's goal is not to prove anything. The artist's goal is not to convince. Because the moment the artist tries to convince the public of something, they are no longer acting as an artist. So go back here. The artist is a creator of beautiful things. What is an artist? It's someone who creates beautiful things. The moment the artist tries to prove something to their audience, I want you to become Christians. I want you to become Muslims. I want you to become Marxists. I want you to become liberal Democrats. I want you to become monarchists. Whatever, take your pick of ideology. The moment the artist is trying to prove something, they no longer become an artist. Even things that are true can be proved. That's a little cheeky comment. No artist has ethical sympathies. What I mentioned earlier, an ethical sympathy in an artist is an unpardonable mannerism of style. Same thing. If the artist has ethical sympathies, meaning I am trying to convince my audience to do a particular thing, or I am going to write or produce a work of art with an ideology in mind, that is a mannerism of style. And that reduces the beauty of the art, and in many cases just drowns it entirely. Is that as long as you are trying to prove something and convince your audience of something in a work of art, it is always going to be a bad work of art. Continue forward. No artist is ever morbid. No artist is ever morbid. The artist can express everything. Again, are there certain things that we shouldn't talk about in art? No. Go back to the famous dictum. Nothing human is alien to me. This is the artist's credo. Nothing human is alien to me. Why? His materials for producing the art are the moral actions of human beings. And so in a novel, in a film, in an opera, the moral actions of human beings are part of the material of the art itself. The worst, most vile things a human being can do, an artist can describe without being morbid, as long as his goal is to do what? Produce beautiful things. Continuing forward, you can see many of these kind of repeat ideas and kind of say them in different ways, or say them in ways that look controversial. Because, of course, when he says something like, there is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book, it makes it seem like he's an immoralist. It makes it seem like Oscar Wilde is saying, effectively, morality doesn't matter. It's all just nihilism. I'm going to shove in your face, we can do whatever we want. That's actually the opposite of what he's saying. But the people who get upset about this are which type of people? The type of people who find ugly meanings in beautiful things. They're the same type of people who criticized his book, The Picture of Dorian Gray, for being immoral. Many people thought The Picture of Dorian Gray was extremely immoral, that it should be censored, that it should be taken out of print. Well, why do they make these claims? They're confronted with a beautiful thing and they found an ugly meaning in it. Why did they find an ugly meaning in it? Because they are trying to assess books by the standards of morality rather than by the standards of aesthetics. Good. Thought and language are, to the artist, instruments of an art. So again, how is art produced? Through thought and through language. Vice and virtue are to the artist materials for an art. This goes back to what we were saying earlier. I can depict the highest highs and the lowest lows of the human existence without being morbid. The artist can depict anything because human action constitute part of the materials of an art. From the point of view of form, the type of all the arts is the art of the musician. This is taken directly from Walter Pater, because it says effectively the most pure form of art that we have from the perspective of form. What is the closest thing that we have to the form of the beautiful? And Walter Pater is going to say it's music. And that actually goes back to Plato, because Plato is effectively going to say the education of children, this is in the Republic, the education of the young should proceed by two means: gymnastics and music. And many modern people, influenced by modern pedagogy and modern education system, they read that and they're like, that's the dumbest thing on earth. You're telling me no math, no study of literature, no study of writing, nothing. Just gymnastics and music. But the argument Plato makes actually makes a lot of sense for this, which is that gymnastics cultivates the body. Music cultivates the soul. Why? Because music is piped directly into your soul. The moment you hear music, you are moved. It's the closest thing to having beauty injected into your veins, right? It's the closest thing to the form of beauty itself, because music is a purely non-representational art. Music is a purely non-representational art. It's not trying to represent a state of affairs the way a novel is. Like a novel actually talks about people doing things that could possibly happen in this world. Music itself does not convey anything. We could all listen to the Tannhäuser Overture, and different things could be going through our mind. Whereas if we all read the first chapter of The Picture of Dorian Gray, your vision of what that looks like may be slightly different from my vision, but it's a far more concrete art. And if we all look at the Mona Lisa, we're all going to be seeing the same thing. But music is pure form. It's just the beauty itself being translated to you in an experience that is independent of all of the senses except for hearing. There's no sight. There's no intellectual component. There's no gustatory component, right? It's just sound. And so music is the purest form of art we have. And so Plato said for that reason, we have to take care of music. Because, and this is a quote from the Republic, directly taken from the Republic, to change the modes of music is to change the modes of the society. Think about the 1960s. Think about the change in music we saw in the 1960s, and think about the level of social change that has happened since then. What you listen to is going to affect the way you see the world, because it's being piped directly into your soul. I had students always tell me, that's ridiculous, that's stupid. You go to a nightclub, are they playing Mozart? No. Because you can't, I always say, you know how people dance in nightclubs. You would never dance like that if Mozart was playing. You would never dance like that if, oh my goodness, Gregorian chants were playing. You would never dance like that. And vice versa, you don't go into a coffee shop and hear EDM. You don't hear like heavy bass electronic dance music playing in a coffee shop because people are trying to concentrate. People are trying to relax. Music does affect the way you see the world. It affects your soul. And that effect is piped directly into you precisely because music is pure form. An interesting example of this, there's a book, I believe by the title of, Dionysus Rising, which talks about music. I can't remember the exact title. But effectively, the author makes the argument, he says, when you look at atonal music, produced by Schoenberg, produced by the whole cadre of modernist composers. Schoenberg's always the one that come to mind because I studied at UCLA and we would walk by Schoenberg Hall all the time. And it was always so ironic to me that they named a hall at UCLA after Schoenberg because Schoenberg hated UCLA with all of it. He's like, though Schoenberg thought it was so beneath him that he had to teach UCLA students music, which is funny. And UCLA does him the honor of naming a hall after him because Schoenberg became famous. But anyway, the author of this particular book makes the argument that the atonal music actually produces physical illness, and that many of the famous, like musical virtuosos who would play these atonal compositions over and over and over again, or the compositions which are on the dodecaphonic system, would actually start to become physically ill as a result of having to play these compositions which went against natural harmonies. And that's not surprising at all, because if you look in the medieval world, the Ottomans were really big on this. The Ottomans had this idea that if you listen to certain types of music, they had medicinal effects on the body, because the soul and the body are hylomorphic, right? They're related to each other. And so that if you're suffering from a bodily ailment, you can listen to certain types of music to heal it, because the body and the soul are linked, and the music pipes directly into the soul and thus can change the body. And so is it totally surprising, or should we be totally surprised that maybe modern music in quotes, the modernist music, that a lot of it could produce physical illness? I think not. But anyway, this is all just to say, this goes back to the Platonic idea and the Neoplatonic idea, that music is the closest thing that we have to the form of the beautiful itself because it's non-representational art. However, and this is interesting, Wilde makes a caveat here. From the point of view of feeling, the actor's craft is the type. Meaning, when we look at things from the perspective of the emotions, the emotional life of the human being, it is acting, which is like the prototype of art, because acting is putting on the emotion on display. And of course, if you read the picture of Dorian Gray, you're going to see acting plays a huge role in that novel. So he's going to say music is the highest from the point of form, but from the point of feeling, the sort of romantic sense of emotion and great passion, acting then would be the prototype of art. Interesting idea, though somewhat unrelated to the rest of the points made here. Now, we get to the good stuff, and we will close out here. All art is at once surface and symbol. I actually just had this discussion with someone today. We were talking about the conclusion to Crime and Punishment, which I won't spoil too much, but there's a character, Sonia, whose name means wisdom. And Sonia is at once, she is a 19-year-old girl who is a prostitute. She's also Jesus. And she's both of those things at the same time. Why? Because art is surface and symbol. The surface is the literal level. The symbol is the allegorical or metaphorical level. In art is always both and. People who do not understand nuance, particularly people who in the sciences, I find, but just people in general who don't understand nuance, which is increasingly large numbers of people, I think, we don't have to get into the reasons. People who do not understand nuance, they either go with surface or symbol. It's either or. Either Sonia is a 19-year-old girl, or Sonia is a representation of Jesus. But she can't be both of the things at the same time. No, all art is surface and simple. All art has a literal and metaphorical level. And this should be surprising to no one, particularly if you come from a Christian background. St. Augustine is going to say there are 4 interpretations of the Bible. You have the literal level, which I hate because people always talk about the literal interpretation of the Bible as if that's a bad thing. And they misinterpret what is meant by that. But in any case, you have the literal or historical meaning of the Bible. You have the allegorical meaning of the Bible. You have the anagogical meaning of the Bible. And you have the tropological meaning of the Bible. And St. Augustine says you can pull any passage from the Old or New Testament. And those 4 levels of interpretation are there. Meaning there's a historical interpretation. It's about historical events that actually happened. St. Augustine and all the church fathers believe this. It has an allegorical component, which means like there is some larger metaphorical truth going on here. There's a tropological component, which is talking about morality. And there's an anagogical component, which is talking about the last things, meaning the end of the earth, heaven, hell, death, and judgment. And St. Augustine says every passage in the Bible has all 4 of those meanings at the same time. And one meaning does not compromise the other. If you think about it this way, another good way is body and soul. You have a body and you have a soul. The soul does not devour the body. Just because you help the soul doesn't mean the body gets less. And vice versa, by helping the body, it doesn't mean you're destroying your soul. The soul and the body need to cooperate with each other. Is the soul higher than the body? Indeed it is. But you cannot be a being of pure soul any more than you can be a being of pure body. And what's interesting to me is that the medievals tended to err on the side of pure soul. If you get into like hyper-Gnostic or hyper-Neoplatonic interpretations of literature, for example, there are some, oh my goodness, just insanely Neoplatonic interpretations of the Odyssey. They err on the side of soul. Like Origen fell into these errors. The Christian theologian Origen, I love Origen. Origen says many things that are good, but we all know Origen ultimately was condemned for heresy. And Origen's interpretations, they lean towards symbol. They tend to privilege the allegorical at the expense of the literal or the historical. Well, interestingly enough, in modernity, where I would say the focus is much more on the body than on the soul, is much more on matter than on the immaterial, we err on the side of surface. We always go for the literal meaning of things and tend to distrust the fact that there's an allegorical meaning to anything. Well, Oscar Wilde is saying here, if you want to understand art, you have to understand all art is surface and symbol. All art is a combination of a literal and an allegorical meaning. And the allegorical meaning, even though the allegorical meaning is higher than the literal meaning, it does not destroy the literal meaning. Those things work in tandem. Another quick example, I was just working on a student on the myth of Theseus. We were talking about Ariadne and Theseus. And Theseus, of course, goes to kill the Minotaur inside the labyrinth. And I said, this is a metaphor for how we are to escape this life. What does Ariadne give Theseus to help him kill the Minotaur and return out of the labyrinth? He needs a sword and he needs a thread. The thread on the surface looks weaker than the sword. But if Theseus just goes in with the sword and kills the Minotaur, he will be lost inside the maze and he will never return from the maze. If he goes in with just the thread, he will be eaten by the Minotaur and will never return from the maze. He needs both the thread and the sword. And I said, allegorically, what the ancient Greeks were saying by this is that the sword is the body and the thread is the soul. And God has given us 2 means by which we can escape the labyrinth of this life. We must use the body properly, otherwise we will not defeat the Minotaur, but we also must use the mind. We must use the soul. And so the mind or the soul, like what can you do with the mind? What is a thread going to do? If you don't have the thread, you won't escape the maze. You won't get out of this life preserved. Well, in order to get out of this life, in order to get out of the maze, the chaos, the disorder of life on earth, we must use the body properly and we must use the soul properly. Now, that's the allegorical meaning. Is the allegorical meaning there? Yes, the Greeks clearly meant something by Theseus taking a sword and a thread. There was a reason he took those 2 things. But that allegorical meaning does not mean there wasn't a Theseus, that the Greeks want you to think that Theseus wasn't, they want you to just imagine this as a pure story of ideas or just pure philosophy. No. There was a Theseus. And Theseus went into the maze. And by going into the maze, what did Theseus do? Kill the Minotaur. And then return with the Minotaur by using the thread that he had lined up through the walls. There was a literal Theseus, but there was also an allegorical Theseus. And the allegorical meaning and the literal meaning work in harmony with each other. They do not destroy each other. Now, what is interesting here is that what Wilde is going to say is those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril. And that those who read the symbol do so at their peril. What does he mean by this? He says, well, look, To interpret a work of art is always a dangerous thing, because by interpreting a work of art, go back to what we said earlier, right? Let's go take a look at this. By interpreting a work of art, he says, let's take a look here. We're going the wrong way. The highest as the lowest form of criticism is a mode of autobiography. So the critic who interprets the work of art, who conveys their impressions of the beautiful, is putting himself at risk by interpreting the work of art, because he is now exposing his soul. He is effectively saying, this is who I am, in offering an interpretation. And I would say, as someone who has done a good amount of literary criticism, you guys can see the videos on my channel, it does feel like that. I expose aspects of my soul, of my person, of who I am when I give interpretations of different literary works. And you can see a lot about me, I think legitimately, in my interpretations of literature. And so he says, Oscar Wilde is offering a warning. If you go beneath the surface of a work of art, if you go beneath just the literal, I'm just reading for plot. Because that's so many people, right? Is like, how many people do you know who are like, oh, I'm a big reader? Look at all the people on BookTube, okay? I hate BookTube. BookTube is not my thing. What I'm trying to do on this channel is the opposite of BookTube. But if you go on BookTube, it's all people who read for plot. They're like, oh, this was an interesting story. It's like they're watching like an HBO miniseries or like a Netflix miniseries. But instead of like watching a Netflix miniseries, they're reading a book. And they think that this makes them superior. Okay? It's like, hey, reading is superior in itself. And so I'm going to read nice, like interesting stories that are the equivalent of, I don't know, watching Breaking Bad. That's insulting Breaking Bad. That's the equivalent of watching like some crappy garbage TV show on Netflix. And I'm just going to read, and I'm going to read for plot. What matters to me are the plot and the characters. Well, they focus on the surface. All they care about is the surface. That's why, like, these types of people, they tend to love fantasy, like bad science fiction novels like, my goodness, don't get mad that I throw some out, but like Wheel of Time, my goodness, what's the other? Game of Thrones, is like they're interested in plot. They're interested in plot and characters and interesting happenings. That's just surface. And no surprise, in our own era, which is so focused on the material, which is so focused on the body, which is so focused on the quantitative rather than the qualitative. You could read Rene Guénon, The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times for more on that. But if you look at our own era, you see the focus is clearly on matter. And is it no surprise, people are interested in plot more than they are interested in symbol. Whereas if you go to earlier periods of time, in ancient Greece and in the Christian European West, people were more interested in symbol than they were in surface, which is still an error, but I would say is an error that's actually much more human. In any case, what Oscar Wilde means here is that once we go beneath the surface and start to analyze a work and break down what's going on and get to the allegorical or the metaphorical interpretations, we expose ourselves. So be warned, literary critics. If you want to say something about my work or about any literary work, you will ultimately be saying more about yourself than you will be saying about the work, which I think is 100% true. It's very, very wise on Oscar Wilde's part to say that. Good. It is the spectator and not life that art really mirrors. Art does not mirror life. Art does not mirror life. Art mirrors beauty. Because in a certain sense, and this is an idea that Oscar Wilde is going to play with a little bit in the picture of Dorian Gray itself, art is more real than reality. Art is more real than reality. Why? Because art, as a condensed, as a curated version of reality, is more beautiful than reality that we normally experience. Now, I don't know if Oscar Wilde would take it that far. I might take it that far, actually. Oscar Wilde, I think, has a more ambivalent relationship with that particular idea. It does come up in the picture of Dorian Gray, but the idea behind it is that art is not trying to copy this life. That Oscar Wilde is clear about. Art is not trying to be a carbon copy of this life. That's actually why, like, the real historical Plato, not the interpreters of Plato or the Neoplatonists. The real Plato was very skeptical of art because he said it's a copy of a copy. The world that we live in, the world of becoming, is a bastardized copy of the world of being. If you have questions on that, you can go watch my videos on transcendentalism. I talk a lot about Plato. And in fact, I talk a lot about Plato in the video on St. Basil the Great as well, if you're confused on this. But you have the world of being, the world of form, which is the world of perfection, and it's eternal and unchanging. And then you have our world of chaos, where everything is constantly changing, and that's the world of becoming. And he says, imagine how bad it is. Like, if this world of becoming is such an inferior copy of the world of being, an artist who's going to take this world and then make a copy of that is making a copy of a copy. How inferior must that be to the world of being? And so Plato makes the accusation that art is actually worse than this world. That when you turn to a work of art, you are actually like hiding from this world. Oscar Wilde is going to disagree. He's going to say, no, art is not a copy of this world. Art is a copy of something else. It's a copy of beauty. But interestingly, art mirrors the spectator. Go back to Caliban. What does realism do? It holds up the mirror to Caliban. What does romanticism do? It holds up the mirror to Caliban. Well, what does art do to the critic? It holds up a mirror to the critic. When you interpret a work of art, you are talking about yourself. When you interpret a work of art, you are talking about yourself. You are being mirrored. Art is a Rorschach test to say things about you. And so Oscar Wilde, I think, is doing this, one, because he legitimately believes it, but two, is to say, critics, beware. If you're going to say something bad about my novel, it's really you that you're saying something bad about. Because my novel is a thing of beauty. My goal in producing this novel was not to propagandize, but was to make a beautiful thing. I'm not desiring to prove something. I have no ethical sympathies. I just wanted to make a beautiful thing. And if you look at this beautiful thing that I have made, which I truly believe is beautiful, and you find something ugly in it, you are corrupt without being charming. You are saying something bad about yourself. And I would say that's true. All the critics who hate this novel, and still people to this day who go, oh, should this novel really be taught? Isn't it kind of lurid? Doesn't it have a bad meaning? So on and so forth. That is corrupt without being charming. That is a deficiency, or what would you say? To have a poorly adjusted soul and aesthetic sensibility. And the critics who say that about whatever work of art are revealing something about themselves. Good. Last comments here. I quite love these. Diversity of opinion about a work of art shows that the work is new, vital, new, complex, and vital. And so what is meant by that? I'm actually going to move myself back over here. What is meant by that? Diversity about a work of art shows that the work is new, complex, and vital. When people disagree about a work of art, it shows that the work of art is doing something powerful. So when a work of art generates controversy and multiple interpretations, the more interpretations that are generated by a work of art show to, what would you say? There's a positive correlation between the number of interpretations and the intensity of the various interpretations of a work of art and how good a work of art is. If everyone agrees on what something means, it's a sign that it's not a good work of art. Think about the Bible. How many millions of interpretations do we have of the Bible? Or the Odyssey? There are millions of, picture the biggest house you could imagine. You could fill every room of that house with literary criticism about the Odyssey, and you wouldn't even touch 1% of all the things that have been written about the Odyssey, or the Bible, or of the Quran, or of any of the major texts of the world traditions, the Upanishads. Why? Diversity of opinion signals there's something vital. The more people disagree about a work of art, the better a work of art it is. Now, this comment kind of comes out of nowhere, but I think is really apt. It's like, look, if a work of art is generating controversy, that's because it's doing something good. If all the critics agree that, oh, this is a wonderful work of art, it means this. It's because it's a bad work of art. And pay attention, right, as they say in Spanish, ojo, pay attention in our own time. When all the literary critics, when the entire New York literary establishment says, oh, this novel is brilliant, is it really a brilliant novel? Is anyone going to remember it 10 years from now? I think not. When all the film critics say, oh, this film, it's deep, it's provocative, it gets to the heart of whatever. When all the literary critics and all the film critics agree on something, do we really think something interesting is being done? I think not. I think most of the film critics, choice films, everyone universally agrees that this is brilliant. And everyone has the exact same interpretation. Those are not the best films. Those are not the best novels. And what you will find is most of the novels that we now, from 100 years ago, that we now think are brilliant, very few people in their own time thought were brilliant. Or if they did, there was a lot of controversy about them. And certainly this was true of Oscar Wilde. Good. When critics disagree, the artist is in accord with himself. Why? Because he knows he has produced art. When the artist sees critics fighting over his art, it's good, it's bad, it's this, it's the other, it means this, it means that, the artist can take a sigh of relief. He can go, I did my job. He can say what the Buddha said when the Buddha died. Quran Katanium, done what is needed to be done. I love that line. Done what is needed to be done. I have produced art. I can be at peace because the critics are fighting. The critics fighting is a sign that I have done my job. Good. We can forgive a man for making a useful thing as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that one admires it intensely. Very beautiful. We can forgive a man for making a useful thing as long as he does not admire it. Practical things. We can make them without admiring them. We can make, for example, a car that is useful for a family, is cheap. But we cannot admire it, eh? You can, a Hyundai Santa Fe. Hyundai Santa Fe, great car. Someone has a family, phenomenal car. Cheap, affordable, reliable, excellent car. Is anyone going to say a Hyundai Santa Fe is a work of art? No. Someone might say, though, that a Ferrari is a work of art. Well, because a Ferrari is impractical. You don't need a Ferrari to drive down I-90. Okay, you just don't. You don't need a Ferrari for city driving. You can drive a Ferrari fast on a closed track, but it's impractical. You're going to spend all that money for speed you're never going to use? That's what makes a Ferrari beautiful. You can have a useful thing as long as you don't admire it. Houses in the suburbs, incredibly useful, incredibly comfortable, nice, amenable living. Especially compared to think of European apartments in the city. European apartments in this extremely impractical. There's no central air, right? The floor pan arrangements all weird, this, that, the other. Houses in the U.S., in the suburbs, extremely practical. Does anyone admire them as works of art? Far from it. Most people say they're ugly. Similarly, the only excuse for making a useless thing is that one admires it intensely. I always think of this, and this is going to sound weird to people. Super Mario 64 speedrunning is the most useless thing you could possibly imagine. The thousands, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of hours, maybe not hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of hours that have gone into Super Mario 64 speedrunning. Cancer's not getting cured. No one's getting fed. No clean drinking water is coming from this. We're not solving any major political problems. We're not winning any Nobel Peace Prizes with this one. Yes, but that's why people admire Super Mario 64 speedrunning. It's if you watch Super Mario 64 speedrunning, you play the original Super Mario 64, you go watch speedruns of it, you study how the speedrunning is done, you go, that is a work of art. People have put so much psychic and emotional energy into being able to do this useless thing, which is to be able to play Super Mario 64 at brokenly fast levels. That is a sign that it's beautiful. It is the most useless thing you can imagine. Why do people dedicate so much energy to a Super Mario 64 speedrun? Doing it over and over and over. Doing the same thing. The people who are the best at this, every single day, they wake up and they'll stream 12 hours of them playing Super Mario 64 in the hopes of beating it a fraction of a second faster. They will study hundreds of thousands of lines of code looking for the tiniest possible exploits. If you look into the math and the science of how people do these broken runs, it is absurd. And yet that's precisely why it's beautiful. Why is a Hyundai Santa Fe not beautiful and a Super Mario 64 run beautiful? Because the Super Mario 64 run is beautiful. It doesn't get the kids to school. It's not solving world hunger. But that's why it's beautiful. Is because it's so useless. It is pure beauty. That we could do something like that. It's not trying to solve any problems. It is just a conveying of beauty. Whereas the practical things, I made a bridge, I made an app, I started a business that's worth $250 million. Okay, fine. Yeah, no problem. You want to start a business, that's fine. But you can't admire it. Don't admire a business like it's a work of art. Same with solving math problems. Some of the most famous math problems that have been solved, it's you look at proofs, and I know people who are very into math, they'll always say, that was a beautiful proof. But why do they use the language of beauty? It's because many math problems have no practical application. There are math problems that have been solved that will never have any practical application. And yet the fact that someone could solve them is a beautiful thing. Why? Because it's useless. Precisely because it's useless. It's beautiful that people solve it. It is a pure conveying of beauty. As practical utility goes up, artistic value goes down. And as artistic value goes up, practical utility goes down. Why? No artist desires to prove anything. No artist has ethical sympathies. Art is not trying to accomplish something. It's not trying to bring about a practical thing. Art is not trying to solve world hunger. Art is not trying to bring about world peace. Art is not trying to convince people to become a Christian or a Muslim or a Hindu. It's not trying to convince people to become a Marxist or to become a liberal Democrat or to become a monarchist or to become whatever ideology or religion. It is trying to convey beauty. And to that extent, all art is quite useless. Which is the real joke. Because on the one hand, all art is useless. It doesn't feed anybody to make a painting. It doesn't solve anyone's problems to make a poem. And yet, I love this quote. It's from a second-rate Spanish poet, Emilio Carrere. And he has a line, see if I can get it right. Crear un bello verso vale una vida entera. Crear un bello verso vale una vida entera. To create a beautiful verse is worth an entire lifetime. Which is true. Because why? Beauty is a reflection of the highest things that we have, the transcendentals, the most absolute, the most real, the more real than real life things. Absolute goodness, absolute truth, and absolute beauty, and ultimately, God. That makes art useless because it does not accomplish practical things in this world, but it reflects the highest things that we know. Absolute truth, absolute goodness, and absolute beauty. And for that reason, all art is quite useless, but at the same time, and this is the biting sarcasm, art is the highest thing that we have in this life. It is the most real thing that we have in this life because it is a reflection of the absolute reality from which we all have our origins. Phenomenal. Just a beautiful statement of Christian aesthetic philosophy, of Neoplatonic aesthetic philosophy, of Platonic aesthetic philosophy in this little preface. So I hope I've done a good job of breaking it down for you and that you have a better understanding of it after watching this video than you had before. If you have any questions, definitely leave them in the comments. I get that this is a complicated topic. I'd be happy to cover more of this, more philosophy videos, and also more American literature survey videos coming soon. I promise. Been a bit delayed on those, but those will be coming out soon. As always, give a look in the description if you're interested in my college degree accelerator program to help you graduate by the age of 19 or 20, as I myself did. And as always, I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you all around. Take care.